Welcome back to Conservative Commandos. I'm Rick Manning. George Landreth has left the building, but I'm here today with Robert Romano, who's Vice President of Public Policy for Americans for Limited Government. And I want to give you a little window into some of the things that happen in Americans for Limited Government because Robert and I spend a great deal of time debating issues before we end up writing things that you can find on dailytorch.com, our publication that we publish every single day, 5 days a week with unique articles and perspectives on issues that you won't get in the mainstream media. But so I'd encourage you to check out dailytorch.com. But Robert and I spent a lot of time on a lot of different issues, sometimes complicated issues, and trying to figure out what's the right answer. And so I wanted to be able to take this segment and the next one and tackle two different kinds of subjects, although they're interlinked, both economic, and sort of give you an eye into Robert and I kind of going back and forth and spitballing on some things. And I think hopefully you'll come to a better understanding of the deliberative process at Americans for Limited Government, but also you'll get a better sense of some of the nuances and struggles in terms of trying to figure out what the right answer is on some of these questions. One of the main ones that we've been focused on for quite a while has been China. What do you do about China? Being in favor of the tariffs is a relatively unpopular thing in some conservative circles, and yet Americans for Limited Government has decided that tariffs are in fact constitutional, A, which is clearly in the Constitution, and B, that tariffs are desirable. That in fact, in a world where China is not playing fair, tariffs are really one of the few weapons available to the United States to prevent the hollowing out of our economy. Robert, you've got some really strong thoughts on tariffs and the like. How do you view tariffs, and what impact have tariffs had, both in terms of the trade balance and and why does the trade balance matter, for that matter? So tell me a little bit what you're thinking about that.
Well, so far the tariffs, they had been at 25% on $250 billion of goods. The president is taking that up to 30%, and he had threatened 10% on the remaining $300 billion of goods, including high-tech goods. He was going to delay that till December. Then the Chinese came back and said, we're doing 75 billion of tariffs on you. And so Trump said, okay, in September, we're going up to 15%. So no more delay until December. The president's been getting really tough, and he's attempting to offset the cost advantage that China has been able to exert via currency manipulation through yuan devaluation. They did a massive devaluation in the mid-90s. They were given most favored trading status in 2000. They were allowed into the WTO in 2001, and ever since then, they've blown up their global manufacturing market share. While ours has declined precipitously, the U.S. economy has not grown above 4% since 2000, not above 3% since 2005. And so I think the reason Trump got elected, if you look at the Rust Belt states in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, the reason he got elected was because he promised to address this. He was painting Clinton up as pro-NAFTA. Bill Clinton obviously was there when NAFTA went into effect. And he shepherded in the most favored nation status for vis-a-vis China. So I think this is an attempt by the president. He's doing the right thing. China's not our friend, and they're not even a friend of freedom. They keep people in concentration camps. They allegedly harvest the organs of their political prisoners, including Falun Gong and the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province. I think that this is there is a moral case to be made, and I think that that's a part of why, if you are on a trade deficit with Japan, nobody really cares because Japan's our friend. They help forward U.S. interests in the Asia region. Therefore, they're a part of our national security sphere. But China's not a part of that. China's arming North Korea. China gets a $380 billion deficit with us, trade deficit every year. That pays for more than 2 years of Chinese military spending. So what are they doing? They're creating a first-rate navy. They're arming North Korea. They're engaging in nuclear blackmail, therefore. And we're paying for it. What the heck are we doing? Why have we taken leave of our senses? This is why the American people voted for President Trump in 2016, and probably why they'll vote for him again in 2020.
Well, let me ask you very specifically. There's a large contingent of people who make the case that we as Americans, because China can make it cheaper, we benefit by having lower prices, and the those lower prices help other parts of our economy thrive because we're not having to pay as much for a television set. President Trump has obviously imposed sanctions. What is the net effect on A, prices, and B, have the supply lines changed in terms of corporations importing strictly from China, or are they beginning to diversify where things are coming from?
Well, just again on the moral case, you could justify slavery by saying that you can get cheaper goods that way. So I'm not certain that what you get in return and what effect that has on humanity we should consider. On prices, since the president has done tariffs, the inflation rate has been stable. It's actually slowing down a little bit. You could be looking at a little bit of an economic slowdown starting to be baked into the cake here. But that has nothing to do with the tariffs. The prediction that the opponents of tariffs made was that this would result in inflation and that it would cause prices to go up. Prices are not going up on consumer inflation. And in the meantime, it does appear to be shifting production away from China. The trade and goods deficit with China this year is down 10% from at this point in the year. And so I think that the tariffs are having an effect. The president just hiked them up in May. He's hiking them up again now. And this is going to have a further impact. And I think it's really hurting China's economy right now. It's why they're moving very rapidly to further devalue the yuan. It remains to be seen whether they can fully offset the cost of the tariffs. But I think the incentive is for other countries, now, especially now that the president's starting to implement sanctions, to go to other places. We just did a trade deal with Japan. We could produce stuff in Japan. We could produce stuff in India. We could produce it elsewhere. We could produce it in Mexico under the USMCA. We don't have to produce it in China. We could produce it here. There's no reason why we shouldn't be giving the Chinese almost $400 billion a year to build a first-rate navy to defeat us.
Well, and one of the things we've seen, and this was reported on, I think, Wall Street Journal. I referenced it in an article I did for Breitbart about that ran last Friday. It's on China and how the president is going to beat China by doing trade deals with other countries around the world. So I'd recommend that article. It's also available on dailytorch.com. If you look at that idea, what we're seeing is about 50 companies. They found 50 companies that were actively moving things, their manufacturing and their supply chain out of China. Now, the expectation was that those were going to move to the United States. I think and that's not happening. Only one of those companies moved their actual manufacturing operation here. 49 of them moved them elsewhere. But in moving them elsewhere, what we've done is we've diversified the supply chain. So we're not dependent upon things coming from China. Things for like auto parts and other things like that are now being diversified to Vietnam, Mexico, Indonesia, elsewhere around in Asia primarily. And as a result of that, China then doesn't have hegemony over the supply chains for the goods that we purchase here, and they then have to compete with other countries, which means they no longer can operate as a sole source provider, and they are forced into a position where they lose their power. And that's one of the geniuses of what's going on is this moving supply chain. Businesses are complaining about it, but the fact is, that's what's good. That's what's in American interest, and ultimately, that's what's in the multinationals' interest is not to be dependent upon China. We're going to come back after the break, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve and some things that the Federal Reserve could or should be doing to try to help us win this trade war, as opposed to what they say they will be doing. At least one former member is advocating that they actually try to help us lose the trade war, which seems almost treasonous. But we'll talk about that after the break. Robert, we're going to get right down to it because our time is short. Let me ask you this: the Federal Reserve has a special role in monetary policy. As you stated in the previous segment, and as the president's complained, the Chinese engage in currency manipulation in order to have an unfair advantage. Effectively, what they do is we put tariffs on, and the Chinese devalue their currency so that their products are always cheaper than our products. No matter what happens, their products are always cheaper than our products. It's how they've hollowed out the steel industry. And even with the increased tariffs on steel, we're not seeing the steel industry still struggling because the Chinese have lowered their prices significantly, and based on the currency manipulation. So tell me, what should the Federal Reserve? I know the president's been really mad at Jerome Powell, the Fed head. What should the Federal Reserve be doing, and are they doing it, or are they obstructing the president's policy?
Well, I think the Federal Reserve should be paying attention to exchange rates. That's the lesson of the Great Depression when other countries were coming off of the interwar gold standard, the UK starting in 1931. It has a deflationary impact upon trading partners. And we were a big trading partner with the British back then, and unemployment went to the moon. It went from about 9% all the way up to 25%. Deflation worsened, and it wasn't until we came off of the gold standard and started devaluing ourselves that inflation was restored and the unemployment rate began coming down. Everything else FDR was doing with the New Deal, none of it was really as impactful as currency. And so if that's and that this is what the central bankers, their literature has been saying for decades. It was our fault. Oh, we didn't know about the gold standard. We needed to devalue. How are we supposed to know? Well, now we're in exactly the same situation since 2000 with these trading situations with China, where they're devaluing. Mexico devalues the peso. The Europeans devalue the euro. Japan and South Korea. Everyone's playing the same game here. But because we're the world's reserve currency, there's a perverse incentive for everyone else to stockpile treasuries like their gold. And that in turn devalues their currencies even more so. So what could the Fed do? The Fed has a couple of things. They can buy bonds, they can sell bonds, they can raise interest rates, they can lower interest rates. And the federal funds rate has inverted above the 10-year Treasury for about a few months now, since May. And they could cut the federal funds rate so that to cure that inversion. But they haven't done that yet. They've only
What is
gone
the
down a
federal funds
quarter
rate,
of a point.
Robert?
They'll probably go down another quarter point in September. And so this inversion is probably going to last a bit longer if you're looking at the 10-year and the federal funds rate.
What is the
That
federal
said,
funds rate? What is the federal funds rate?
what is the federal funds rate? That is the policy rate that the Federal Reserve sets. That is the rate at which they lend to banks, the so-called interbank lending rate. It's the lowest of the rates. It's supposed to be really low. And the 10 years down to a 1.5 or even less, then the federal funds rate is sitting above that. It should probably come down. If they're now the danger, of course, is that we're about to pursue probably negative interest rates on bond markets. The Federal Reserve will be under a big pressure to go negative as well. I think this is a mistake. However, it shows that we're in a deflationary cycle, that the dollar is simply too strong. What kind of central bank do we have? Monetary policy, where they don't pay attention to the strength of the dollar and exchange rates.
Well, I thought that was their whole purpose of existence.
It's supposed to be what they're supposed to pay attention to, but really what they do is they facilitate the treasury trade, the carry trade, and it help banks to get more profitable, helps other countries to spread the wealth around the world. And it really does come at the expense of America, and it makes our goods too expensive. It makes it too expensive to do business here in the United States. And it's a massive tax on the American people when you look at it that way. That's why President Trump's probably going to have to take matters into his own hands. He can go and do sanctions against China, and he's already threatened to do so. You could block China out of treasuries markets if they really wanted to. That's under the International Economic Emergency Powers Act of 1977.
Okay, but let's just be hold on.
Against Iran, Russia, Libya, Syria.
Isn't if just be fair? Sanctions against China is a pretty extreme measure because given how interconnected our economies are and how many of the U.S. based businesses have business in China, wouldn't that effectively force any U.S. based business to have to either cease to be a U.S. based business or completely disengage from having any operations in China? Apple, for instance, says that it'll take them about 3 years to fully disengage from China and be able to do that. And the sanctions have put a say it has to be done immediately. So are sanctions really a viable alternative?
I think that the president is actually running out of time and he's running out of options with regards to this. Back in 2003, former President George W. Bush made a moral case for trade with China, said it would lead to more democracy, more liberty, and it would open them up, and then we would have a friend in China. Instead, President Xi has consolidated power. He's leader for life now. We've seen the concentration camps. We hear the allegations about the organ harvesting. These are crimes against humanity. We are underwriting genocide. Why would we do this? If you just change the name China for Russia or Iran, there's sanctions yesterday.
Well, let me just be clear. Those things they're doing to their own people are obviously concerning, but let me give you something they're doing to our people. Fentanyl is a Chinese creation. Fentanyl is you touch it and you die. It is that lethal, and it is used for some legitimate opioids that are sold as prescription medicine, but it is also on the black market. Just yesterday, the Mexican Navy interdicted a ship that had 25 tons of fentanyl on it. That is enough to kill every man, woman, and child in America. And it was destined to come across our border, southern border, and enter our streets. That's where it was destined to be. And so when you look at that, and the president has dealt with Xi on this, he's had him promise on multiple occasions that he was going to stop this. And China's a closed society, unlike America. They have the capacity to stop the manufacturing of it. They have the capacity to do those kinds of things because one of the advantages and few advantages of being a communist country is you control the industry, at which point they could choke it off and kill it tomorrow if they wanted to. They don't want to. And we lose 30,000, we lost 70,000 people each year for the last couple of years for opioid deaths. About 30 to 35,000 of those are fentanyl directly related. That means China's opium war against us has killed 30,000 people, Americans, a year. That's 10 times what was killed at the World Trade Center. And it is a policy. 150 years ago, China lost face and lost a war to Great Britain based on that's called the Opium Wars because effectively Great Britain addicted all of China to opium, and the Chinese lost 100 years of history as a result of that, and they remember it, and now they're doing it to us. It is a war. The moral case against China trade is that they're killing 30,000 of our people every single year with fentanyl, and that's outrageous. And we have to stop them. President Trump has negotiated with them. He's made this a top priority to try to get it done. And I predict that if Xi stopped the fentanyl trade, the rest of it would fall into place. There would be a deal made. But as long as Americans are dying from opioid addiction that's directly from China, I don't see President Trump turning his back on the hollowing out of rural America and urban America and losing our youths based on this drug addiction. We don't have much time left, Robert. We got about 30 seconds. Would you like to wrap?
Sure. The president has already, and the U.S. Treasury are already enacting those sanctions on fentanyl and going after the companies in China. They're doing sanctions on the Chinese banks that are arming North Korea. So to the extent that they are challenging the United States and harming our security and killing our people, the president and his administration are proactive. They take this threat seriously, and it's about time.
Yeah, there's no more illusion that China is the good guy and we just need to all get along. Fact is, China's in a war, has been conducting warfare against the United States, economic and now drug warfare against the United States for about 20 years, 30 years, and we've just finally woken up to it. So all those folks out there who sit there and just want to go back to the good old days, the fact is the good old days were China conducting warfare against us while we just lay back and take it. The time of lay back and take it is gone. And we've got to start standing up for America. That's why the president won, and that's why he's standing up to China. on that note, we're going to have to close out today's show. And I really appreciate everybody who listened today and viewed us today.